You know what movies get wrong about D-Day? Almost everything. Those Hollywood scenes showing soldiers storming off landing craft and charging up the beach in some kind of heroic wave. That's not how it went down. In reality, the men who landed on those Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944, faced a kill zone so horrific that many died before their boots even touched French soil. Within the first 10 minutes, the sea along Omaha Beach turned red with American blood as German machine guns cut down entire squads before they could find any cover at all. But here's the part they really don't tell you. The actual invasion wasn't a single day. After those beaches were taken, the Battle of Normandy dragged on for another 85 days. 85 days of pure hell as Allied soldiers fought their way through the deadly maze of Normandy's countryside. It was a battle that cost nearly 500,000 casualties on all sides and shattered the myth of German invincibility forever. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. All right. Let's head back to 1944. Trust me, it's going to be quite a ride. But first, get comfortable. Seriously. Adjust those pillows, pull up that blanket, because where we're going, you're going to want to be cozy. So congratulations, you just woke up in the belly of a landing craft headed for Omaha Beach. You're a 19-year-old American kid named Tommy Miller from a small town in Ohio, and you've never seen combat before. None of you have. You're shoulder to shoulder with 30 other guys, all packed tight into this metal box that's bouncing across the English Channel like some kind of demented carnival ride. The air is thick with the smell of diesel fuel, wet wool, and vomit. So much vomit. The June weather over the channel is rough. 10-foot waves smash against the landing craft, sending icy salt water spraying over the sides. Almost everyone is seasick. Most of the men have been throwing up all night, including you. Your stomach is empty now, but you're still dry heaving. Your uniform is soaked through with sweat, seawater, and whatever else. It's heavy, clinging to your skin in all the wrong places. Not like your warm bed right now, with its clean sheets and gentle weight of blankets that somehow feel just right. Dawn is breaking over the horizon, but you can barely see it. The sky is split by tracer rounds. The thunderous boom of naval guns firing from Allied ships makes the whole landing craft shudder. Your ears are ringing. Everything smells like cordite and salt and fear. The young lieutenant who's supposed to be leading you looks as terrified as you feel. His face is green, not just from seasickness. This isn't what any of you expected. The training back in England didn't prepare you for this chaos. 5 minutes, shouts the coxswain, the sailor operating the landing craft. The knot in your stomach tightens. You look down at your gear, checking it for the 20th time. Your M1 Garand rifle is wrapped in cellophane to keep the salt water out. You've got bandoliers of ammunition across your chest, a combat pack, entrenching tool, canteen, first aid kit, and enough other equipment to make you feel like you're going to sink straight to the bottom when you hit the water. 60 pounds of gear at least. Next to you, your buddy Mike from basic training is silently mouthing what looks like a prayer. The guy on your other side, you don't even know his name, is staring at a small photo of a young woman. His hands are shaking so badly you think he might drop it into the sloshing water at your feet. Remember, the lieutenant shouts over the din, when that ramp drops, move fast. Don't stop on the beach. Head for the seawall. Find cover where you can. Easy for him to say. You try to swallow, but your mouth is bone dry despite the spray soaking your face. Through the metal sides of the landing craft, you can hear the relentless pounding of artillery, the sharp crack of small arms fire, and worst of all, the steady mechanical hammering of MG-42 machine guns. The Germans call it the bone saw. You've heard the rumours it can fire 1-200 rounds per minute, fast enough to cut a man in half. The landing craft hits something, a sandbar probably, and lurches sickeningly to one side. Men stumble into each other. Someone's helmet clatters to the floor. The pitch of the engine changes as the coxswain struggles to push through. 30 seconds! The fear is physical now. It's a cold weight in your chest, making it hard to breathe. Your knees feel like they might give out. You're not sure if it's the rocking of the boat or your own terror that's making you sway. The noise is getting louder. Shells are exploding nearby, sending geysers of water into the air. You hear the unmistakable ping of bullets hitting the metal ramp at the front of the landing craft. Stand by! Everyone tenses. This is it. The landing craft grinds forward, then stops with a shuddering jolt as it hits the beach. There's a mechanical clank as the ramp begins to lower. Light floods in, momentarily blinding you after the dimness inside, and then the world explodes. The instant the ramp drops, machine gun fire rakes across the opening. The first 4 men are cut down before they can even move. Their bodies crumple, blocking the exit. Blood pools around your boots. The lieutenant is screaming for everyone to move, to get off the boat. It's a death trap now. You stumble forward, tripping over the fallen men. Someone pushes you from behind. Suddenly you're in the water, not on the beach but in the freezing water of the English Channel. It's deeper than you expected, well over your waist. The weight of your equipment tries to drag you down. Your waterproofed rifle is clutched above your head with one hand as you desperately try to keep it dry. All around you, men are struggling through the water. Some disappear beneath the surface, pulled down by their heavy packs. Others are hit by bullets that crack across the water's surface like evil raindrops. The sea is stained pink, then red. You push forward. Each step is a battle against the water, the soft sand beneath your feet, and your own fear. Your legs burn with the effort. The cold numbs your hands, but the beach is ahead, offering no protection but at least solid ground. The noise is overwhelming. Explosions, gunfire, the mechanical buzz of the German MG-42s, the shouts and screams of men. It's a cacophony of death that makes it impossible to think clearly. Your training takes over. Move forward, find cover, stay alive. You finally reach the beach, water streaming from your uniform. The sand is a mess of obstacles, wooden stakes, metal hedgehogs designed to rip open landing craft, coils of barbed wire, and bodies, so many bodies, scattered across the beach like discarded toys. Ahead is about 200 yards of open beach. Beyond that, the seawall and bluffs where the German guns are firing from. It might as well be 200 miles. The beach offers almost no cover, just a few wooden obstacles and the occasional shell crater. You sprint forward, zigzagging as you've been trained. 10 yards, 20. Your lungs burn. Your soaked uniform weighs you down. Bullets kick up sand around your feet. The man running next to you suddenly jerks and falls face first into the sand. You don't stop. You reach a shell crater and dive in, landing hard on your stomach. The breath is knocked from your lungs. 2 other men are already there, pressed against the far side of the crater. One is a medic, frantically working on a wounded soldier who's missing part of his arm. The other is a radio man, his equipment shattered and useless. "We gotta keep moving," the radio man shouts over the din. "We're sitting ducks here." He's right, but the prospect of leaving this small depression in the sand, the only thing between you and the German bullets, is terrifying. You look back toward the water. More landing craft are approaching. More men wading through the red surf. Many never make it. You check your rifle, peeling away the wet cellophane. It seems to be working. You take a deep breath, nod to the radioman, and prepare to move again. "On 3, he shouts. 1, 2. Before he can say 3, a mortar shell explodes nearby, showering your crater with sand and shrapnel. Your ears ring. For a moment, you can't hear anything. The world moves in slow motion. You blink sand from your eyes and realize the radio man is pulling at your arm. He's shouting something, but you can't make it out. You stumble to your feet and follow him as he runs toward another crater about 30 yards ahead. Somehow, you both make it. This crater is larger and holds several men, including a sergeant who seems to have taken charge. Your hearing is starting to come back, enough to catch snippets of what he's saying. Need to clear those obstacles, engineers, Bangalores, move up to the seawall. You nod, as if you understand, though the words barely register. You're still alive. That's all that matters at the moment. Time loses meaning on the beach. It could be minutes or hours that you spend moving from crater to crater, slowly making your way forward. The tide is coming in, shrinking the beach, pushing men into the killing zone. The dead and wounded line the water's edge, some being pulled back into the surf by the retreating waves. Eventually, you find yourself at the base of the seawall, a low concrete barrier that offers the first real protection from the German fire. Hundreds of men are gathered here, pinned down by the guns above. Officers are trying to organize an assault on the bluffs, but communication is almost impossible in the chaos. You press your back against the cold concrete, grateful for the momentary respite. Your uniform is caked with wet sand. Your hands are raw and bleeding. Your throat burns with thirst, but when you reach for your canteen, you find it's been punctured by shrapnel. Empty. A colonel moves along the seawall, rallying men. "We didn't come this far to die on the beach," he shouts. "We need to take those bluffs or we'll all be killed when the tide comes in." He organizes teams to use Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes filled with explosives, to blow holes in the barbed wire above the seawall. You're assigned to one of these teams, given the terrifying job of helping to place the explosive. Your team waits for covering fire, then scrambles up the sloping ground above the seawall. You keep your head down as bullets whiz overhead. The Bangalore is heavy, awkward. You help push it through the barbed wire while another soldier primes the fuse. "Fire in the hole!" someone shouts, and you all dive for cover. The explosion rips a hole in the wire, sending twisted metal flying. Before the dust settles, men are charging through the gap. You follow, rifle at the ready. The ground is steep, slippery with sand and blood. Your lungs burn as you climb. Somehow, you reach the top of the bluff. The German trenches are just ahead. You can see the helmets of enemy soldiers, the barrels of their weapons. They're firing desperately now, knowing what's coming. The Americans around you let out a ragged cheer as they close in on the German positions. There's no artistry to what happens next. It's brutal, close-quarters combat, rifle fire, grenades, even fists and bayonets. Men scream in English and German. The trenches change hands one bloody yard at a time. You fire your Garand until it's empty, then reload with shaking hands. You see things you'll never forget. Men torn apart by grenades, others begging for their mothers as life leaves them. You move forward in a daze, acting on instinct and training. By late afternoon, your unit has secured a small section of the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. The German defenders have fallen back to secondary positions. You've survived the landing, something that seemed impossible just hours ago. You find yourself in a captured German bunker as the sun begins to set. The concrete walls are pockmarked with bullet holes. The floor is littered with empty shell casings. It smells of cordite, sweat, and death, but it's shelter. Someone passes around canteens and K-rations. You eat mechanically, not tasting the food. Your hands won't stop trembling. You've been awake for nearly 40 hours now, but sleep seems impossible. Every time you close your eyes, you see the beach and the men who didn't make it. A lieutenant comes through, taking stock of who's left. Your company landed with 197 men that morning. Only 87 remain. You learn that your buddy Mike didn't make it off the landing craft. The faceless lieutenant who led you toward the beach died in the water. These facts register distantly, as if happening to someone else. Get some rest if you can, the lieutenant tells everyone. We move inland at first light. You find a corner of the bunker, prop your rifle against the wall and sink to the cold floor. Your muscles ache. Your uniform is still damp, chafing against your skin. Outside, the sounds of battle continue. Sporadic gunfire, distant explosions, the rumble of vehicles moving up from the beach. As darkness falls over Normandy, you realize that D-Day is over. You've survived. But this is just the beginning. The Germans still hold most of France. The real battle, the one that will last through the summer, is only just starting. You close your eyes, knowing that tomorrow will bring more fighting, more death. But for now, in this concrete bunker with its smell of gunpowder and fear, you're still alive. And somewhere in Ohio, your mother still believes you're safe at a training camp in England. She has no idea that her son just lived through the most massive seaborne invasion in human history. No idea that you've already seen more death than most people will in a lifetime. No idea that the beach you landed on today will soon have a new name in the history books: Bloody Omaha. You drift into an uneasy sleep, your rifle clutched to your chest like a child's teddy bear, as the sounds of war continue through the Norman night. The German army is regrouping, bringing reinforcements. The war is far from over. The beachhead is secure, but inland the hedgerows wait. Thousands of small fields enclosed by ancient earthen berms topped with tangled hedges, a perfect defensive terrain that will soon become a killing ground for both sides, a place where tanks struggle to maneuver and soldiers die in small anonymous battles for tiny patches of French soil. Tomorrow, the real Battle of Normandy begins, but for now, you sleep, the shallow, alert sleep of a soldier in a war zone, ready to wake at the slightest sound, ready to fight again when dawn breaks over the blood-soaked shores of France. As night settles over Normandy, the naval guns continue their bombardment further inland, their distant thunder a strange, violent lullaby. Medics work by flashlight in makeshift aid stations. Landing craft continue to bring men and supplies to the secured beaches. The massive invasion machine grinds forward, unstoppable now. And in a concrete bunker that smells of death, a 19-year-old boy from Ohio dreams of home, his innocence left somewhere on the blood-red sands of Omaha Beach. While Tommy and thousands of others were preparing to hit the beaches of Normandy, another battle was already underway. Hours before the first landing craft touched the shoreline, the night sky over France had filled with the distant drone of aircraft engines. Inside those planes, men prepared for what many considered a suicide mission, jumping into enemy territory in the dark of night. James Cooper sat rigid in the belly of a C-47 transport plane, the metal bench cold beneath him despite the June heat. A 22-year-old sergeant with the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, he'd been awake for nearly 24 hours, keyed up on a mixture of fear, anticipation, and the terrible coffee they'd been served before boarding. The interior of the aircraft was dim, lit only by a single red bulb that cast everyone in a hellish glow. 20 men sat in 2 rows, backs against the fuselage, knees almost touching the men across from them. Each paratrooper was laden with equipment: main parachute on the back, reserve chute on the chest, M1 rifle broken down and stowed in a special valise attached to the leg, plus ammunition, grenades, rations, medical supplies and mission-specific gear. All told, They were jumping with nearly 100 pounds strapped to their bodies. Cooper glanced at his watch. Just past midnight on June 6th, in less than an hour, they'd be dropping into occupied France. Their mission, secure the causeways leading from Utah Beach to allow the seaborne forces to move inland once they landed at dawn. The man beside him, a private from Tennessee named Wilkins, was mumbling what sounded like a prayer. Across the narrow aisle, Lieutenant Winters was reviewing a map by the dim red light. Most of the others sat in silence, lost in their own thoughts. Some slept, an ability Cooper had always envied but never mastered. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, dropping suddenly before catching itself. Several men cursed. Someone retched into a canvas bag. The smell of vomit mixed with the ever-present odours of sweat, cigarettes, and the coconut-scented insect repellent they'd all liberally applied. The distinctive scent of gun oil hung in the air too. They'd all cleaned their weapons obsessively in the days before, knowing their lives would depend on them. Cooper felt the weight of the cricket clicker in his pocket, a simple toy that made a metallic click-clack when pressed. Tonight, it would be a vital recognition signal. One click was to be answered with 2 clicks, identifying friend from foe in the darkness. Such a small thing to stake your life on. Through the small circular window, Cooper could see other C-47s, their outlines barely visible against the night sky. Hundreds of aircraft flying in formation, all headed for the Cottontown Peninsula. Below them was the English Channel, black and forbidding. The jumpmaster moved through the cramped space, checking equipment one last time. 20 minutes to drop zone, he shouted over the engine noise. Cooper's mouth went dry. This was it. After 2 years of training, endless practice jumps, physical conditioning and combat drills, they were finally going to war. The invasion that would liberate Europe was beginning, and they were the tip of the spear. "Stand up!" The jumpmaster's command cut through the drone of the engines. 20 men rose as one, joints cracking, equipment jangling. "Hook up!" Each man connected the static line from his parachute to the cable running along the ceiling of the aircraft. "Check equipment." Cooper ran his hands over his gear, then checked the man in front of him. The ritual was so deeply ingrained he could have done it in his sleep. "Sound off for equipment check." The count began from the rear of the plane, each man shouting his number when his equipment had been verified. As they neared the coast of France, the aircraft began to buck and weave. Flak, anti-aircraft fire burst around them, black puffs against the night sky. The C-47 had no armour, no defensive weapons. It was essentially a flying target. "We're taking fire," someone shouted unnecessarily. The plane lurched violently as the pilot took evasive action. Men stumbled, grabbing onto each other for support. Cooper's stomach knotted as the green light near the door finally illuminated. The jumpmaster slid open the door and cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of cordite and the distant sound of explosions. "Go, go, go!" One by one, the paratroopers shuffled toward the door, disappearing into the darkness. Cooper moved forward mechanically, his body operating on muscle memory. When his turn came, he didn't hesitate, couldn't hesitate. He launched himself into the void. The slipstream caught him immediately, the prop blast from the aircraft's engines slamming into him with physical force. For a terrible second, he tumbled uncontrolled through the darkness. Then came the jerk as his parachute deployed, the straps cutting into his shoulders. The sudden transition from falling to floating. The noise of the aircraft faded, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the distant sounds of anti-aircraft fire and the rustling of his parachute canopy. Cooper looked around, trying to orient himself. Below, France was a patchwork of dark shapes. He could make out fields, hedgerows, and what might be a road, all illuminated by the intermittent glow of flares and explosions. Everywhere he looked, white parachutes descended like ghostly jellyfish, but something was wrong. They were scattered, spread out over miles instead of dropping in tight formation on the designated drop zones. The planes had been forced to break formation by the anti-aircraft fire, and now the entire airborne division was being dispersed across the Norman countryside. The ground rushed up faster than expected. Cooper had been trained to land with knees together, feet and knees slightly bent to absorb the impact, then roll to distribute the force. But in the darkness, he couldn't see the ground clearly. He hit hard, the shock travelling up his legs. He rolled awkwardly, his equipment digging into his side. For a moment, he lay there, the breath knocked from his lungs. Then training took over. He needed to get out of his harness, retrieve his weapon, and find the rest of his unit. Every second in the open increased the chances of being spotted by German patrols. Cooper's fingers worked quickly at the clasps of his harness. The parachute had to be buried or hidden. White silk would be a beacon to enemy aircraft in daylight. His jump had been rougher than most training drops. He could feel where bruises would form tomorrow, if there was a tomorrow. Once free of the parachute, he assembled his rifle with practiced movements. The familiar weight of the M1 Garand was reassuring in his hands. Next, he needed to figure out where he was, and more importantly, where everyone else was. He pulled out his cricket clicker and pressed it once. Click, clack. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the darkness. He waited, straining to hear a response. Nothing. He tried again, moving slowly through the field where he'd landed. Click, clack. From somewhere to his left came a faint reply. Click, clack, click, clack. Cooper moved toward the sound, keeping low. His boots made soft squelching noises in the wet grass. The field was bordered by one of the distinctive Norman hedgerows, earthen embankments topped with tangled vegetation that had stood for centuries. These ancient field boundaries would become their worst nightmare in the days to come, but for now they offered welcome concealment. Flash, Cooper whispered as he approached the dark shape crouched by the hedgerow. Thunder, came the reply. The verbal recognition signals they'd memorized. The figure was Wilkins, the man who'd sat next to him on the plane. The private looked relatively unscathed, though there was a tear in his jumpsuit. "Any sign of the others?" Cooper asked, keeping his voice low. Wilkins shook his head. "I saw chutes all over the place. We're miles from the drop zone." This was the nightmare scenario they'd prepared for but hoped wouldn't happen. Entire companies scattered across the countryside, individual soldiers or small groups trying to complete missions meant for hundreds of coordinated troops. "We need to figure out where we are," Cooper said, pulling out his compass and map. These were specially made, waterproof silk maps that wouldn't rustle when unfolded, compasses the size of a shirt button that could be hidden if captured. They had no idea where they were. The invasion planners had created detailed mock-ups of the drop zones and objectives, but they hadn't prepared the men for being lost in the maze of small fields and hedgerows that characterized the Norman landscape. "I think that's a road over there," Wilkins said, pointing. Cooper nodded. "Let's check it. Stay low and quiet." They moved through the darkness, alert for any sound that might indicate German patrols. Their boots sank into the muddy ground. It had rained recently, making the fields soggy and treacherous. The hedgerows loomed like black walls in the darkness, tunnel-like passages between fields that could hide friend or enemy. As they approached the road, Cooper suddenly raised his hand, signalling a halt. Voices drifted through the night air. Speaking German, he dropped to his stomach, Wilkins following suit. Through the gaps in the hedgerow, they could make out the shapes of several soldiers on the road, the outlines of their coal scuttle helmets unmistakable. Cooper's heart hammered in his chest. There were at least 6 Germans armed with MP-40 submachine guns from the looks of it. He and Wilkins were outnumbered and outgunned. Their orders were to avoid engagement until they found their units, to focus on their objectives rather than isolated skirmishes. They lay perfectly still as the German patrol passed. Cooper could smell cigarette smoke, hear snippets of conversation. The Germans seemed relaxed, unaware that thousands of Allied paratroopers were scattered across the countryside around them. That wouldn't last long. When the patrol was gone, Cooper and Wilkins crossed the road and continued their search for friendly forces. The night was filled with distant sounds of combat, sporadic gunfire, the occasional explosion, the drone of aircraft overhead, scattered battles as lost paratroopers encountered German units. They moved from hedgerow to hedgerow, field to field, using their cricket clickers sparingly now, aware that the Germans would soon catch on to the system. Hours passed in this careful navigation of enemy territory. They encountered no one, neither friend nor foe, which was both a blessing and a curse. They needed to find their unit, to complete their mission, but at least they weren't being shot at. Dawn was approaching, the eastern sky beginning to lighten. Being caught in the open in daylight would be dangerous. They needed to find other Americans, and soon. "Listen," Wilkins said suddenly. Cooper stopped. At first he heard nothing beyond the ambient sounds of early morning. A light breeze, rustling leaves, distant gunfire that had become almost background noise. Then he caught it. The soft, repetitive click-clack of a cricket clicker. They responded and moved cautiously toward the sound. In a sunken lane between 2 fields, they found a group of about 15 paratroopers from mixed units, 101st and 82nd Airborne, even a British paratrooper who'd somehow ended up miles from his drop zone. They were led by a lieutenant from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. "Where are we headed, sir?" Cooper asked after introductions were made. The lieutenant pointed to his map. "We're about 3 miles from St. Mary-Glise. Word is the 505th has taken the town, or at least parts of it. We're going to head there, link up with whoever we can find, then move toward our objectives." Cooper nodded. At least they had a plan now. As the improvised unit prepared to move out, he checked his equipment one last time. His canteen was still full, his ammunition dry. The invasion was hours old, and he hadn't fired a shot yet, hadn't even seen a German up close. That would change soon enough. The group moved out just as the first true light of dawn broke over the hedgerows. They stayed off the roads, moving through fields and woods where possible. Occasionally, they heard the sounds of combat in the distance, the distinctive crack of American M1 rifles, the different report of German Mausers, the rattling burst of machine guns. They were passing through an apple orchard when they had their first real encounter with the enemy. A German machine gun opened fire from a farmhouse about 200 yards away, the bullets cutting through leaves and branches, sending splinters flying. "Cover!" the lieutenant shouted unnecessarily. Everyone was already diving for the ground. Cooper found himself behind the gnarled trunk of an apple tree, hardly adequate protection from machine gun fire. Wilkins was a few trees away, returning fire with his M1. The British paratrooper, Cooper had learned his name was Mills, was working his way around the flank with another man, trying to get an angle on the farmhouse. The lieutenant organised a base of fire, half the men shooting at the farmhouse to keep the Germans occupied, while the other half manoeuvred closer. Cooper was with the base of fire group, his rifle braced against the tree trunk as he took careful aim at the windows of the farmhouse. The firefight lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt much longer. Mills and 3 Americans managed to get close enough to toss grenades through the windows. The explosion was followed by silence, then the surrender of the 3 surviving Germans, young men who looked scared and confused. They had no time to take prisoners. After a brief interrogation through one paratrooper who spoke some German, they learned that a full company of Wehrmacht infantry was stationed in a nearby village. The lieutenant made the hard decision to leave the Germans tied up in the farmhouse, taking their weapons and ammunition. "We'll tell the first Allied unit we encounter where they are," he explained to Cooper, who had questioned the decision. "But our mission comes first." Cooper understood the logic, even if it felt wrong to leave enemy soldiers behind who might free themselves and rejoin the fight. War was full of imperfect choices. They continued toward Sainte-Mère-Église, moving more cautiously now. The countryside was waking up, not just soldiers but French civilians peering cautiously from farmhouses, trying to determine what was happening. Some waved or offered water when they identified the Americans. Others shut their doors and windows, fearful of being caught between opposing forces. Around mid-morning, they encountered a larger group of American paratroopers who had established a defensive position at a crossroads. Their commanding officer, a captain from the 506th, had managed to gather nearly 60 men from various units. "We're heading toward the causeway at Pouperville," the captain told them after they'd joined his group. "That's one of our primary objectives, securing the exits from Utah Beach so the seaborne forces can move inland." Cooper felt a surge of purpose. Finally, they were getting back to their mission. The scattered drops had created chaos, but the adaptability of the paratroopers was beginning to impose some order on the situation. Small groups were finding each other, coalescing into larger units, moving toward their objectives despite the confusion. As they prepared to move out, the distant sound of naval gunfire reached them, the massive bombardment preceding the beach landings. The invasion was in full swing now, thousands of men fighting their way ashore as Cooper and his fellow paratroopers fought to secure the inland objectives. They moved through a series of small fields, each bordered by the tall hedgerows that would become so notorious in the coming weeks. The captain split them into two groups, one to provide covering fire, the other to advance. Then they would switch roles, leapfrogging forward through enemy territory. Cooper found himself alongside Mills, the British paratrooper, as they waited for the signal to advance. The man's red beret marked him as part of the British 6th Airborne Division, which had dropped east of the American zones. "How'd you end up with us Yanks?" Cooper asked to pass the time. Mills shrugged. "Bloody pilot got lost in the dark, dropped us miles off course, lost the rest of my stick in the drop." He checked the magazine on his Sten gun, a compact submachine gun that Cooper had always thought looked too flimsy for combat. "Figure I might as well help you lot until I can find my unit." The signal came, a raised hand from the sergeant leading their element. They moved forward at a crouch, passing through a gap in the hedgerow that had been located by scouts. The next field was empty except for a few cows that regarded the armed men with placid indifference. For Cooper, the next few hours blurred together, moving from field to field, occasional firefights with German patrols or isolated positions, brief moments of rest to check maps and reorganize. By early afternoon, they had linked up with more paratroopers and were approaching the causeway at Pouperville. Here, they encountered their first serious resistance, a German strongpoint guarding the road from the beach. About 30 Wehrmacht soldiers with machine guns and a single 20mm anti-aircraft gun that had been repositioned to fire at ground targets. The battle was brief but intense. The Americans used their superior numbers and firepower to overwhelm the German position. Cooper found himself advancing through smoke and dust, firing his M1 at shapes that hardly seemed human. The crack of rifles, the burp of submachine guns, and the screams of wounded men created a hellish soundtrack. When it was over, the causeway was in American hands. They had completed at least one of their D-Day objectives, though hours later than planned. As they established defensive positions, an American officer arrived with news from the beaches. "Utah Beach is secure," he told them. "The 4th Infantry Division is moving inland. Omaha had a rough time, but they've established a beachhead. We're holding a corridor about 3 miles deep in some places, less in others." The news brought a mixture of relief and renewed purpose. The invasion was succeeding despite the chaos and scattered drops. The paratroopers had done their job, disrupting German communications, capturing key bridges and road junctions, creating confusion behind enemy lines that prevented a coordinated response to the beach landings. As evening approached, Cooper found a moment of quiet in the shelter of a stone wall. His uniform was filthy, stained with mud, grass, and blood, though thankfully none of it his own. He was bone-tired, having been awake for nearly 40 hours. His hands shook slightly as he opened a K-ration packet and forced himself to eat the unappetizing contents. The peaceful Norman countryside seemed at odds with the violence that had erupted across it. Cows still grazed in fields where men had died hours before. Apple trees heavy with unripe fruit stood witness to firefights and mortar barrages. Somewhere, French civilians huddled in cellars, waiting for the storm of war to pass over them. Tomorrow would bring more fighting as they pushed to link up with the forces from the beaches to expand the fragile foothold they'd established in Hitler's fortress Europe. But for now, Cooper watched the sunset paint the hedgerows gold and allowed himself to believe he might survive this, after all. The night settled around them, bringing a temporary halt to major operations. Sporadic gunfire continued, nervous sentries shooting at shadows, isolated skirmishes as units continued to find each other in the darkness. The vast airborne drop zone was slowly being consolidated, order emerging from chaos. In the distance, the rumble of naval guns continued. The invasion fleet remained offshore, pouring men and material onto the beaches. Somewhere out there, thousands of soldiers were experiencing their first night on French soil, just as Cooper was. Different approaches, sea and air, but all part of the same massive operation to liberate Europe. As stars appeared overhead, Cooper thought about the long journey that had brought him here, from a small town in Pennsylvania to a hedgerow in Normandy, training jumps at Fort Benning, the crossing to England, endless drills and exercises, all for this moment, this foothold in France that would eventually become the road to Berlin. He settled in for a few hours of rest, his rifle across his lap, ready to respond instantly if needed. Around him, other paratroopers did the same, catching sleep in short bursts, one eye always open. Their war had just begun. 2 weeks after D-Day, the Allied advance had slowed to a crawl. The beaches were secure, the paratroopers had linked up with the seaborne forces, and supplies flowed steadily across the English Channel. But inland, the American, British, and Canadian soldiers faced a new kind of hell. One that no amount of training had prepared them for: the Normandy bocage. Tommy Miller, the young soldier from Ohio who had survived the bloody landing at Omaha Beach, now found himself in a maze of ancient hedgerows. His company had advanced just 8 miles in 14 days, a pace that could be matched by a determined snail, and every foot of ground had been paid for in blood. "Keep your damn head down," Staff Sergeant Frank Gaines hissed, yanking Tommy back by his webbing. The crack of a rifle shot followed a split second later, the bullet whizzing through the space where Tommy's head had just been. Fragments of bark exploded from a nearby apple tree. "Sorry, Sarge," Tommy mumbled, pressing himself lower into the wet earth. The rain that had been falling intermittently for days had turned everything to mud. His uniform hadn't been properly dry in a week. His boots squelched with every step. The damp had worked its way into everything. Rifles that needed constant cleaning and oiling to prevent rust, ammunition that had to be kept meticulously dry, rations that turned to soggy mush in their pockets. "They got a sniper in that farmhouse," Gaines said, peering through field glasses at the stone structure about 300 yards ahead. "Been picking at us all morning." Tommy's platoon was pinned down along one of the ubiquitous hedgerows that crisscrossed the Norman countryside. These weren't the neatly trimmed hedges of English gardens. They were earthen berms, sometimes 10 feet high, topped with tangled trees and brush that had grown together over centuries. The roots ran deep, creating walls that no tank could easily breach. Each field was its own fortress, and the Germans had turned them into killing grounds. "What are we supposed to do?" asked PFC Rodriguez, the barman who joined their unit as a replacement just a week ago. "We can't stay here all day." "Wait for the mortars," Gaines replied. "Lieutenant called in a fire mission, should be dropping any minute now." As if on cue, the distant crump of American mortars firing reached them, followed seconds later by explosions around the farmhouse. The Germans had learned to take cover quickly, though. Tommy doubted the mortar barrage would do much more than keep their heads down for a few minutes. "First squad, get ready to move," Lieutenant Hayes called from further down the hedgerow. "Second squad provides covering fire." Tommy was in first squad. He checked his M1 Garand for what felt like the 100th time that day, making sure the action was clear of mud. The lieutenant's whistle blew, and second squad opened up, pouring fire toward the German positions. Tommy and the others rose into a crouch and began to move. They didn't head straight for the farmhouse. That would have been suicide. Instead, they moved laterally along the hedgerow, looking for the gap they'd been told existed somewhere to the left. Each hedgerow-bordered field connected to others through narrow openings, creating a labyrinth that favoured defenders. The gap, when they found it, was barely wide enough for one man at a time. The squad bunched up as they filtered through, each soldier hunched over to present a smaller target. Tommy was fourth in line. As he slipped through the gap, the world seemed to narrow to a tunnel of green. Dripping leaves above, mud below, and the smell of wet vegetation all around. Then he was through in the next field, moving along the inside of another hedgerow that ran perpendicular to the first. The plan was simple in theory: flank the German position by moving through 2 more fields, then hit the farmhouse from the side where they'd have less cover. But simple plans rarely survived contact with the enemy. They were halfway across the second field when machine gun fire erupted from the hedgerow ahead. The distinctive sound of the German MG-42, like ripping canvas, sent everyone diving for cover, but there was no cover in the middle of a muddy field. "Move left," the sergeant shouted. "Get to the hedgerow." Tommy scrambled on hands and knees, then in a desperate crouch run toward the relative safety of the hedgerow they'd just left. Bullets kicked up mud around him. The man to his right, Henley, a replacement who'd arrived just 3 days ago, jerked suddenly and fell face first into the mud. He didn't get up. Somehow, Tommy reached the hedgerow. He pressed his back against the slick earth of the berm, chest heaving, ears ringing from the machine gun fire. 4 others made it with him. 3 didn't. "They knew we were coming," Rodriguez gasped, his face spattered with mud and what might have been blood. "They're on every damn hedgerow." "Lieutenant's hit," another soldier reported. "Saw him go down near the gap." Tommy closed his eyes for a moment. Lieutenant Hayes had been one of the few original officers left from D-Day, a good man who'd somehow kept most of them alive through the first 2 weeks of hedgerow hell. "What now, Sarge?" Tommy asked, turning to Gaines, but Sergeant Gaines wasn't there. In the chaos, they'd been separated. Tommy realized with a sinking feeling that he was now the highest-ranking soldier in their little group, a corporal with exactly 17 days of combat experience. "We need to get back to the company," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Find the gap again and head back the way we came." "What about Henley and the others?" Rodriguez asked. "We'll come back for them," Tommy said, knowing it might not be true. In the hedgerows, the wounded often lay where they fell until nightfall. When stretcher bearers might risk retrieving them, many bled out before help arrived. They worked their way back along the hedgerow, staying low, moving from tree to tree where the vegetation was thinner. The German machine gun fired sporadically, more to keep them pinned than with any real targets. The gap, when they found it again, was now covered by German fire. They could hear American weapons on the other side, the rest of the company still fighting, but crossing that gap would be suicide. "We need to find another way around," Tommy decided. "There's usually more than one gap in these hedgerows," and so began an hours-long ordeal of navigating the bocage, moving from field to field, trying to circle back to their unit while avoiding German patrols and fixed positions. The overcast sky made it difficult to maintain direction. The fields all looked the same, small rectangles or irregular shapes of muddy farmland bordered by the omnipresent hedgerows. By mid-afternoon, they were thoroughly lost. The sounds of battle had receded, which could mean either that the fighting had moved on or that they had wandered away from it. Their little group had grown to 7 as they'd encountered other lost American soldiers, including a radio man named Parker, whose equipment had been damaged by a bullet. "Can't you fix it?" Tommy had asked when they found him trying to repair his SCR-300 radio in the shelter of a bombed-out cowshed. "Not without parts," Parker replied, took a round right through the transmitter. They took shelter in that same cowshed as the rain intensified. The structure was only partially standing, but even a half roof was better than nothing. Tommy organized a watch rotation, placing men at each corner of the building. If the Germans found them here, at least they wouldn't be surprised. "What happens if we can't find our unit?" Rodriguez asked as they shared K-rations, processed cheese and stale crackers that tasted like wet cardboard. "We keep moving east," Tommy said with more confidence than he felt. "That's the direction of the advance. We'll run into Americans eventually. If the Germans don't find us first," he thought, but didn't say. As evening approached, the rain finally stopped. Tommy climbed carefully to the remaining section of hayloft to get a better view of the surrounding area. From this slight elevation, he could see over some of the hedgerows. What he saw didn't lift his spirits. The Norman countryside stretched in all directions, a patchwork quilt of small fields divided by the dark lines of hedgerows. Here and there, pillars of smoke rose from burning buildings or vehicles. In the far distance, he could see flashes of artillery, but nothing that clearly indicated where American lines might be. He was about to climb down when movement caught his eye. A column of American vehicles, including several tanks, was moving along a road about half a mile east. His heart leapt. Friendlies, and not too far away. "Found our guys," he reported when he returned to the others. "Looks like elements of the 2nd Armoured moving on a road east of here." "Thank Christ," someone muttered. "I've had enough of these damn hedgerows to last a lifetime." They set out immediately, hoping to reach the American column before dark, but navigating the bocage remained as challenging as ever. What looked like a half-mile journey as the crow flies became a winding 2-mile trek through the maze of hedgerow-bordered fields. The sun was setting by the time they finally reached the road. The tank column was long gone, but they found an American aid station set up in a sturdy stone farmhouse. Medics were treating wounded men inside, while military police directed traffic at a nearby crossroads. 4th Infantry Division, one of the MPs asked when Tommy's group approached. "First," Tommy replied, "got separated during an attack this morning. Where are we exactly?" The MP showed them on a map. They had wandered nearly 2 miles from their unit's position. The good news was that the division was scheduled to be pulled off the line tomorrow for rest and reorganization. If they stayed at the aid station overnight, they could catch a ride back to their unit in the morning. That night, Tommy slept on the floor of the farmhouse kitchen, his first time indoors in 2 weeks. The floor was hard, but it was dry, and for a few hours he was relatively safe from German shells and bullets. In the Norman darkness, artillery flashed on the horizon, but it was distant now, almost like a thunderstorm seen from far away. In the morning, a deuce-and-a-half truck took them back to the 1st Division's position. Tommy found what remained of his company resting in an apple orchard. Of the 197 men who had landed on Omaha Beach, only 51 remained. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. Sergeant Gaines was there, his left arm in a sling from a graze wound. He didn't smile when he saw Tommy and the others, but the relief in his eyes was evident. "Thought you boys were goners," he said. "Good to have you back." "What's the word, Sarge?" Tommy asked. "MP said we're being pulled off the line." Gaines nodded. 24 hours of rest, then we're back at it. Regiment's bringing up some new toys they say will help with these damned hedgerows. The new toys arrived the next day. Bulldozer blades welded to the front of Sherman tanks. The idea was simple. Instead of trying to go through the gaps in the hedgerows where German gunners were always waiting, the modified tanks would plough right through the hedgerows themselves, creating new openings. "They're calling them Rhino tanks," explained the engineering officer who'd come to demonstrate. "The blades came from beach obstacles the Germans left on Omaha and Utah. Turns out they're perfect for cutting through these hedgerows." Tommy watched as one of the modified Shermans approached a hedgerow at a deliberate pace. The welded tusks at the front of the tank dug into the earthen berm, and the tank pushed forward. For a moment it seemed like the ancient barrier would resist even this assault. The tank's treads spun in the mud, engine roaring. Then suddenly the hedgerow gave way and the Sherman pushed through, creating a gap wide enough for vehicles and infantry to follow. A cheer went up from the watching soldiers. After weeks of being channeled through the narrow, predictable gaps in the hedgerows, they finally had a way to make their own paths. "That'll change things," Sergeant Gaines said, a rare smile crossing his weathered face. "Jerry won't know where to set his ambushes now." The brief respite ended all too soon. By the following morning, Tommy's company was back on the line, preparing for yet another attack. The objective was a village called St. Lo, a key road junction that the Germans were defending fanatically. Taking it would mean pushing through miles more of hedgerow country. As they geared up, Tommy noticed how much his platoon had changed in just 2 weeks of combat. More than half the faces were new, replacements who looked impossibly young and scared. The veterans, those who had survived Omaha Beach and the first days in the hedgerows, had a different look. Older, somehow, though most were still in their early 20s. Their movements were efficient, economical. They didn't waste energy on unnecessary talk or motion. Tommy realized he was now one of those veterans. Somewhere in the mud and blood of Normandy, he'd left behind the scared kid from Ohio and become something else. A soldier who understood that survival depended on a mixture of skill, caution, and blind luck. He checked his equipment methodically: rifle clean and oiled, ammunition dry, grenades secure, first aid packet accessible, helmet strapped tight. They moved out just after dawn, advancing behind two of the new Rhino tanks. The armoured vehicles crashed through hedgerows like battering rams, creating paths where none had existed before. The infantry followed close behind, rushing through the new gaps before German gunners could adjust their fields of fire. For the first time since landing in France, Tommy felt like they had the upper hand. They were no longer forced to use the routes the Germans expected, no longer channeled into prepared killing zones. They were making progress, not fast, but steady. Field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, they pushed the Germans back. But the enemy adapted quickly. Unable to predict where the Americans would breach the hedgerows, they fell back on another tactic: mines. By the third day of the new offensive, the Germans had seeded the fields with thousands of anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. The advance slowed again as engineers had to clear paths before the tanks could move forward. The weather turned against them too. More rain fell, turning the Norman soil to thick, clinging mud that bogged down vehicles and exhausted infantry. Men slipped and fell as they tried to climb the muddy slopes of hedgerows. Tanks lost traction and became stranded. Through it all, the artillery rarely stopped. Both sides pounded each other with shells day and night. The Germans had pre-registered their artillery on every field and road junction, allowing them to bring down accurate fire on any American advance. The Allies responded with their superior numbers of guns, raining steel on German positions. Living under constant artillery fire created its own special kind of stress. A shell could arrive without warning at any moment. The only sound was the distant boom of firing, then the incoming whistle, and finally the explosion, if you lived long enough to hear it. Men developed superstitions and routines they believed kept them safe. Some never bunched up in groups larger than 3. Others carried lucky charms: a rabbit's foot, a girlfriend's scarf, a particular coin. One man in Tommy's platoon never changed his socks, convinced that the one time he had done so, his buddy had been killed by a shell. Sleep became a rare and precious commodity. Even when not actively fighting, the men had to dig foxholes for protection from artillery, these often filled with water, forcing soldiers to sleep sitting up, backs against the muddy walls, feet submerged in cold water. Those lucky enough to find shelter in a barn or damaged building still had to contend with the constant noise of warfare and the pressing need for vigilance. Food was another challenge. Hot meals were rare, usually only available when units were pulled back for brief rests. Most of the time, the men subsisted on K-rations, pre-packaged meals that provided adequate nutrition but little satisfaction. Each came in a waxed cardboard box about the size of a cracker box and contained canned meat, spam or processed ham usually, crackers, a chocolate or fruit bar, instant coffee, and 4 cigarettes. Designed to be eaten cold, they became even less appealing when soaked by the constant rain. Personal hygiene deteriorated quickly under these conditions. Shaving became sporadic, then rare, then abandoned altogether by many. Baths or showers were almost non-existent. Men went weeks without changing their uniforms, which became stiff with dirt, sweat, and blood. Skin conditions like trench foot became common as feet remained wet inside boots for days on end. "How's your feet?" Sergeant Gaines asked Tommy during a rare, quiet moment as they huddled under a camouflage poncho, sharing a cigarette. "Not great," Tommy admitted, pulling off a waterlogged boot to reveal white, wrinkled skin. "Can't remember the last time they were dry?" "Change your socks anyway," Gaines advised. "Even wet, clean ones are better than wet, dirty ones, and rub them when you can. Keep the blood flowing." This kind of knowledge, practical wisdom passed from veterans to newcomers, was often the difference between those who survived and those who didn't. Which routes were safer from sniper fire? How to tell from the sound if an artillery shell was going to land near you? The importance of digging your foxhole deep enough despite exhaustion. How to spot tripwires for booby traps. The hedgerow fighting ground on day after day, week after week. Small objectives took on outsized importance. A crossroads, a farm, a small rise that provided observation over the surrounding fields. Men died by the dozens for patches of ground that would have been meaningless in peacetime. Tommy's world narrowed to the immediate. The next field, the next hedgerow, the next meal, the next chance to sleep. The broader war faded from his consciousness. He vaguely knew that fighting continued on Omaha and the other beaches, that supplies and reinforcements poured in daily, that great plans were being formulated by generals miles from the front. But none of that seemed to matter in the claustrophobic confines of the bocage. Time became fluid, measured not in hours or days, but in operations and pauses. The attack on this farm, the defense of that road junction, the night spent in a partially destroyed church, the afternoon huddled in a water-filled foxhole as German shells fell like rain. Sometimes, in brief moments of clarity between operations, Tommy would look around and be startled by where he was and what he was doing. A farm boy from Ohio crouched in the mud of Normandy, thousands of miles from home, trying to kill men he had never met for reasons that seemed increasingly abstract. In those moments, the absurdity of war would hit him like a physical blow. But such moments never lasted long. The next order would come, the next movement forward, the next burst of adrenaline as bullets cracked overhead, and Tommy would be back in the immediate present, all philosophical thoughts pushed aside by the urgent need to survive. One evening in early July, as Tommy's company took shelter in a small village they had captured that day, mail arrived from home. It was the first delivery in weeks, and men fell upon the letters and packages like starving animals. Tommy received 3 letters, 2 from his mother and 1 from a girl he had dated briefly before the war. He sat on an overturned bucket outside a damaged barn and read by the last light of day. His mother's letters were full of the small details of life in Ohio, who had married whom, how the crops were doing, her work with the local Red Cross chapter, normal life continuing as if another world of mud and death didn't exist across the ocean. The girl's letter was different, full of questions about when he might come home, what France was like, whether he had met any pretty French girls. The innocence of it made Tommy smile despite his exhaustion. She had no conception of what his life was like now, and he had no intention of telling her. Some things were better left unshared. As darkness fell, Tommy folded the letters carefully and tucked them inside his jacket, close to his heart. Artillery flashed on the horizon, a constant reminder that tomorrow would bring more fighting, more hedgerows, more death. But for tonight, at least, he had this small connection to home, this reminder that somewhere normal life continued. The next morning brought what the men had been waiting for, a major offensive aimed at finally breaking out of the hedgerow country. Operation Cobra, they called it. The plan was to use carpet bombing by heavy aircraft to blast a gap in the German lines, allowing American armour to pour through and into the open country beyond the bocage. "It's going to be big," Sergeant Gaines told the platoon as they prepared their equipment. "Biggest air show of the war, they say. Hundreds of bombers hitting a narrow front. After that, we go in and mop up whatever's left." The men's spirits lifted at the news. After weeks of slow, grinding combat, the prospect of a breakthrough energized everyone. Tommy found himself checking and rechecking his equipment with renewed focus. Maybe this would be the operation that finally ended the hedgerow hell. As dawn broke on July 25th, Tommy and the others waited in their jump-off positions. The sky was clear for once, perfect conditions for the planned air attack. The men were spread out more than usual. They had been warned that some bombs might fall short, and no one wanted to present a concentrated target. The waiting was the hardest part. Hours passed as the men lay in their foxholes or crouched behind hedgerows. Some dozed, others wrote letters or cleaned their weapons yet again. The tension built with each passing minute. Then, around mid-morning, they heard it, the distant drone of aircraft engines. Looking up, Tommy saw them, hundreds of bombers flying in formation, their metal skins catching the sunlight. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying. "Here it comes," Sergeant Gaines said unnecessarily. "Keep your heads down and pray those boys up there know what they're doing." The first bombs fell far ahead, on the German positions. The earth seemed to shake with each explosion. Huge columns of smoke and dust rose into the air. The sound was unlike anything Tommy had heard before, not the crack of individual shells, but a continuous rolling thunder that seemed to go on forever. Then disaster struck. Some of the bombers released their payloads too early. Tommy watched in horror as explosions marched toward the American lines. Men scrambled for whatever cover they could find as 2,000-pound bombs crashed down around them. The ground heaved beneath Tommy as he pressed himself into his foxhole. Dirt and debris rained down. The concussion from nearby explosions felt like giant hands squeezing his body. For several terrifying minutes, the world consisted of nothing but noise and pressure and fear. When it finally ended, Tommy cautiously raised his head. The landscape had been transformed. Where there had been hedgerows and fields, there was now a cratered moonscape. Dust hung in the air, making it difficult to see or breathe. "Sound off!" Sergeant Gaines shouted, his voice barely audible over the ringing in Tommy's ears. "Who's still with us?" The roll call revealed the cost of the short bombing. 3 men dead, 6 wounded, and they were the lucky ones. Reports filtered in of entire companies wiped out by bombs meant for the enemy. Despite the losses, the order came to advance. The bombing, for all its tragic errors, had shattered the German front line. As Tommy's company moved forward, they encountered dazed German survivors wandering in the devastated landscape. Many surrendered without resistance, too shocked to fight. For the first time since landing in Normandy, they advanced more than a mile in a single day, and the next day brought even more progress as the German lines crumbled. Operation Cobra, despite its costly beginning, was working. The breakout from the hedgerows had begun. As they pushed forward into more open country south of the Bocage, Tommy found himself looking back at the hedgerow country with a mixture of relief and lingering dread. For nearly 7 weeks, that landscape of small fields and ancient barriers had been his world, a green maze where death lurked around every corner. He had entered it a frightened replacement, fresh from the horror of Omaha Beach. He emerged a veteran, hardened by experiences that would stay with him forever. The Battle of Normandy wasn't over. There would be more fighting before France was liberated, but the worst was behind them. The hedgerows, which had cost so many American lives, were now just a memory, though one that would haunt the dreams of survivors for decades to come. As the sun set on the newly liberated French countryside, Tommy found a moment to write in the small notebook he carried. His entry was brief, just a few lines about the bombing, the advance, the sense that something had finally broken in the German defences. but he ended with a thought that summed up the hedgerow experience for thousands of American soldiers. Made it through the bocage, never want to see another hedgerow as long as I live. While Tommy and the other Allied soldiers pushed through the hedgerows of Normandy, a very different experience was unfolding on the other side of the battle lines. For the German defenders, the summer of 1944 brought a desperate struggle against overwhelming odds. A fight they were slowly but inevitably losing. Oberfeldwebel Staff Sergeant Karl Müller peered through his field glasses at the American positions from the concealment of a farmhouse attic. At 32, he was considered an old man by the standards of his unit. Most of the replacements they received now were either teenagers, barely out of Hitler Youth, or middle-aged men who'd previously been deemed unfit for frontline service. The corps of experienced soldiers who had fought in Russia, Africa, and Italy was dwindling daily. "What do you see?" asked Werner, a thin, pale boy of perhaps 17 who had arrived as a replacement just 3 days earlier. "They're bringing up more tanks," Müller replied, watching as Sherman tanks with curious prong-like attachments welded to their fronts moved into position behind the American lines. Something new, some kind of modification. He'd been in Normandy since 1943, part of the 352nd Infantry Division tasked with coastal defence. They'd spent months building bunkers, laying mines, and installing obstacles on the beaches, the vaunted Atlantic Wall that Hitler and Rommel had promised would repel any invasion. But when the Allies had come on June 6th, the wall had failed. Despite inflicting heavy casualties at Omaha Beach, they had not been able to push the Americans back into the sea. What had followed was a fighting retreat through the Norman countryside, using the hedgerows as defensive positions, falling back one field at a time as Allied pressure became too great. It was exhausting, demoralizing work made worse by the overwhelming Allied air superiority that meant any daylight movement risked attack from fighter bombers. "Get some rest," Müller told Werner, handing him the field glasses. "Watch for movement, but don't expose yourself. Their snipers are good." The boy nodded earnestly, still eager to prove himself. Müller wondered how long that eagerness would last once the shelling started again. He made his way down the narrow staircase to the ground floor of the farmhouse, where the rest of his squad had set up their temporary command post. The French family who owned the place had fled days earlier, leaving behind chickens that had become an important supplement to the dwindling German rations. Feldwebel Dieter Schmidt, Müller's second-in-command, looked up from the map he was studying. "Any change? They're bringing up more of those modified tanks," Müller reported. "I think they've figured out how to break through the hedgerows directly instead of using the gaps." Schmidt frowned. The hedgerows had been their best defensive asset, channeling the Americans and British into predictable lanes of approach where machine guns and anti-tank weapons could be pre-sighted for maximum effect. If the Allies could now punch through anywhere they wanted, the already difficult defence would become nearly impossible. "The 88 won't be able to cover enough approaches if they can come through anywhere," Schmidt said, referring to the powerful 88 mm anti-tank gun that was their best weapon against Allied armour. "We'll have to fall back to the next line." Müller nodded. Falling back had become routine over the past weeks. Each night, as darkness provided some protection from Allied aircraft, they would withdraw to new positions, leaving behind small rear guards to slow the enemy advance. It was a tactic born of necessity rather than choice. They simply didn't have the men or ammunition to hold fixed positions against the American juggernaut. The house shuddered as artillery began falling nearby, the Americans' customary preparation before an attack. dust drifted down from the ceiling. A picture of a serene Norman landscape fell from the wall and shattered on the tile floor. "Here they come again," Schmidt said wearily. "Same as yesterday, same as tomorrow." The men moved to their positions, machine guns covering the fields in front of the farmhouse, riflemen at the windows, the 88 concealed in the barn with its barrel poking through a hole in the wall. They had mines scattered across the likely approach routes, tripwires connected to booby traps, and pre-registered artillery points. They would make the Americans pay for every yard of ground. But Mueller harbored no illusions about the ultimate outcome. There were too many Americans, too many tanks, too many planes. The nightly radio reports from headquarters grew more desperate with each passing day. Reinforcements were promised but rarely arrived. Fuel was so scarce that many vehicles had been abandoned. Ammunition had to be carefully rationed. The artillery intensified, walking closer to their position. The men pressed themselves against walls or into foxholes dug in the farmyard. The thunderous explosions shook the ground, rattled teeth, vibrated through bones. Shrapnel tore through the tile roof, sending broken pieces cascading down. In the brief lulls between barrages, Muller could hear the distant rumble of tank engines. The Americans were coming just as they did every day. The routine had become almost predictable. Artillery, then tanks, then infantry. A methodical approach that spoke to the Allies' abundance of resources. They didn't need clever tactics when they could simply pound a position into submission with overwhelming firepower. "They're trying to flank us on the left," Werner called down from his observation post in the attic. "Tanks moving through the orchard." Mueller grabbed his MP-40 submachine gun and moved to a window on the west side of the farmhouse. Through a gap in the hedgerow, he could see the distinctive silhouette of a Sherman tank, its new tusked prow tearing through the ancient barrier as if it were paper. Behind it came American infantry, moving in practiced bounds, some providing covering fire while others advanced. "Schmidt, shift the 88, Mueller shouted. "They're coming through the west hedgerow." But before the anti-tank gun could be repositioned, the world seemed to explode. A shell from another Sherman, hidden behind the first, struck the farmhouse directly. Bricks and mortar erupted in a cloud of dust and debris. Mueller was thrown against the far wall, momentarily stunned by the concussion. Ears ringing, vision blurred, he staggered to his feet. Part of the ceiling had collapsed. Dust filled the air, making it difficult to breathe or see. Someone was screaming in pain. "Schmidt, Werner," Mueller called, coughing as dust filled his lungs. "Report." A figure emerged from the haze. Schmidt, his face streaked with blood from a cut on his forehead. "The 88's gone," he reported grimly. "Direct hit on the barn, Weber and Kraus with it." "And Werner?" Schmidt just shook his head. The boy had been in the attic, directly in the path of the shell's blast. There was no time to mourn. American infantry were approaching the farmhouse, using the knocked-out barn as cover. Mueller could hear the distinctive sound of their M1 Garand rifles, the ping of ejected clips. "Fall back to the cellar," he ordered. "We'll hold as long as we can, then retreat through the back when it gets dark." It was the same pattern they'd followed for weeks. Delay, inflict casualties, withdraw. A fighting retreat across Normandy as the Allied vise slowly tightened. The cellar provided better protection from both artillery and small arms fire. The remaining members of Müller's squad, just 5 men now, less than half their original strength, set up firing positions at the small ground-level windows. They would make the Americans pay a price for the farmhouse, even if they couldn't hold it. The next hours passed in a blur of combat, brief, intense firefights as American soldiers tried to approach the farmhouse, followed by lulls as they pulled back to let their tanks or artillery do the work. The Germans conserved ammunition, taking only the most promising shots. Every bullet was precious now. As evening approached, the attacks tapered off. The Americans had secured the barn and the outlying buildings, but seemed content to wait until morning before pushing for the farmhouse itself. They knew time was on their side. In the relative quiet of dusk, Müller took stock of their situation. They were down to just 4 men now. One had been hit by a sniper while firing from a window. Ammunition was critically low. Food consisted of a few tins of meat and some stale bread. Water was plentiful, at least, thanks to the farmhouse as well. "We'll pull out at 2200 hours, Müller told the others. "Fall back to the rally point at St. Lo. Headquarters is organising a new defensive line there." The men nodded tiredly. They had been through this many times before, abandoning positions under cover of darkness, leaving behind the dead, marching or riding through the night to new lines that would inevitably be attacked the next day. As true darkness fell, they prepared to move. Each man checked his weapon, gathered what ammunition remained, and took a drink from the well. They would travel light, leaving behind everything not essential for combat or survival. At precisely 10 p.m, they slipped out through the cellar's exterior door, which opened into the kitchen garden at the rear of the farmhouse. The night was cloudy, limiting visibility, but also hiding them from American observers. They moved silently through the garden, then across a small stream and into the concealment of a hedgerow that had not yet been breached by Allied tanks. For hours they made their way through the maze-like Norman countryside, avoiding roads and open fields where American patrols might spot them. They moved from hedgerow to hedgerow, from shadow to shadow, alert for any sound that might indicate enemy presence. The landscape, so picturesque in peacetime with its ancient apple orchards and neatly divided fields, had become a nightmare of broken trees, shell craters, and hastily dug graves. The smell of death hung over everything, rotting bodies of men and animals that could not be properly buried amid the constant fighting. Around 2 a.m, they encountered a German reconnaissance unit, motorcyclists from the 2nd SS Panzer Division who were scouting American positions. "You're from the 352nd? The SS lieutenant asked when they identified themselves. Müller nodded. "What's left of us? We're falling back to St. Lo." The lieutenant's face was grim in the moonlight. "St. Lo is being evacuated. New defensive line is along the Lessay-Périllé-Saint-Lucamont front." It was yet another retreat, another admission that they could not hold against the Allied advance. Müller felt a familiar weariness settle over him. How long could this continue before something broke, either the German army's ability to maintain a coherent defence, or the Allied momentum? "We have transport a kilometre back," the lieutenant offered. "You can ride with us to the new line." It was a small mercy in a merciless campaign. Müller and his men had been walking for days, falling back from one position to another. The prospect of even a short ride was welcome. The SS unit's vehicles were concealed in a small copse of trees, 3 motorcycles with sidecars and a captured American jeep. Müller and his men crowded into the vehicles and they set off along narrow country lanes, avoiding main roads where Allied aircraft might catch them even at night. As they rode, Müller found himself seated next to a young SS soldier who couldn't have been more than 18. Despite the elite unit's reputation for fanaticism, the boy looked as tired and dirty as any Wehrmacht infantryman. "How long have you been in Normandy?" Müller asked. "Since D-Day +1, the boy replied. "We were rushed up from Toulouse when the invasion started. Been fighting ever since." Any word from the Eastern Front? Müller had served in Russia before being transferred to France, and he still had friends fighting against the Soviets. The SS soldier shook his head. Nothing good. The Russians launched a big offensive in June. Army Group Center is falling back. It was the story of the war now. Retreat on all fronts. The great advances of 1939 to 1942 had been replaced by a steady contraction as Germany's enemies closed in from east and west. They reached the new defensive line shortly before dawn, a hastily prepared position along a small river. Engineers were working by lamplight to prepare demolitions on the bridges. Infantry units dug foxholes and machine gun nests. A few tanks and self-propelled guns were dug in at key points, their barrels pointing toward the likely avenues of American advance. A harried captain assigned Müller and his men to a section of the line near a stone bridge. "Hold it as long as possible," he instructed. "When the order comes, fall back across the bridge. The engineers will blow it once our forces are across." It was the same story they'd heard at every position for the past month. Hold as long as possible, then retreat. A fighting withdrawal that seemed to have no end point except eventual defeat. Müller set his men to improving their positions, deepening foxholes, creating clear fields of fire, setting up tripwires where possible. The work was familiar, almost comforting in its routine. This was what they did now: prepare, fight, retreat, prepare again. As dawn broke over the Norman countryside, Müller took a moment to observe their surroundings. The small river valley was peaceful in the early morning light. Mist rose from the water. Birds sang in the trees, if not for the men in field-grey uniforms digging defensive positions. It might have been a scene from before the war, a timeless rural landscape that had seen centuries come and go. How many armies had fought over this land before? Romans, Vikings, English, French, all had contested Normandy at some point in its long history. Now Germans and Americans added their blood to soil already rich with the remains of ancient conflicts. The peaceful moment was shattered by the distant rumble of artillery, the Americans beginning their daily bombardment of suspected German positions. Soon shells were falling along the riverline, sending fountains of earth and water into the air. The men hunched in their foxholes, heads down, as fragments of metal and stone rained around them. This was the true nature of the German experience in Normandy: constant retreat under relentless pressure. The glory days of blitzkrieg were long gone, replaced by a grinding defensive war against an enemy with seemingly unlimited resources. Throughout the day they watched as American reconnaissance units probed the riverline, testing for weak points. Occasional firefights broke out, but the main American force had not yet arrived. They were being cautious, methodical. Why rush when time was on their side? As evening approached, Müller received new orders. Their unit would be relieved overnight by elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division. They were to move to St. Lo to join the city's defense. "The Americans are making St. Lo their main objective," the messenger explained. "Every available man is being sent there." Müller nodded, though he wondered how many available men the Wehrmacht could still muster in Normandy. His own regiment, which had landed in France with over 3,000 soldiers, was now down to barely 600 effective fighters. The relief came around midnight. Young SS Panzer Grenadiers with better equipment and fresher faces than Müller's weathered infantrymen. They took over the defensive positions with the confidence of elite troops who had not yet been ground down by weeks of constant combat. A truck transported Müller and his men to St. Lo, or what remained of it. The once picturesque Norman town had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing and artillery. Hardly a building remained intact. The streets were canyons of debris through which German soldiers had created paths for movement. The civilian population had either fled or taken refuge in cellars and improvised bunkers. Their new position was in a partially collapsed church near the centre of town. The stone walls, built centuries ago, had withstood the bombing better than more modern structures. The unit they were replacing, a mixed group of Wehrmacht infantry and Luftwaffe ground crew, pressed into service as combat troops looked even more exhausted than Müller's men. Americans are all around the city, their commander reported before departing. They control the high ground to the north and east. Artillery hits constantly. Watch for snipers. They've infiltrated some of the ruins. It was a bleak assessment, but no worse than what they had faced elsewhere in Normandy. At least in the urban ruins, they were somewhat protected from Allied air power, which dominated the open countryside. Müller organised his depleted squad, now reinforced with a few replacements who had arrived in St. Lo the previous day, into a defensive perimeter within the church ruins. They had a good field of fire down the main street, and the thick stone walls provided better protection than the foxholes and farmhouses they'd been defending for weeks. Among the replacements was an older man named Kramer, perhaps in his 40s, who had been a policeman in Hamburg before being drafted into the Wehrmacht. He handled his rifle with the confidence of a trained marksman, but lacked the combat experience that had kept Müller's core group alive through the Normandy campaign. "Is it always this bad?" Kramer asked as they huddled in the church while American artillery pounded the city. "This?" Müller almost laughed. "This is nothing. You should have seen Omaha Beach on D-Day or the first week in the hedgerows." Kramer looked unconvinced. The constant artillery was terrifying to those who hadn't yet developed the ability to distinguish between shells that would land nearby and those that were merely passing overhead. "You'll learn to tell the difference," Müller assured him. "The ones you need to worry about sound different." It was knowledge that could only be gained through experience, the subtle variations in sound that told a veteran soldier whether to press against the ground or continue what he was doing. Like so many aspects of war, it couldn't be taught in training camps or read in manuals. The night passed in relative quiet, broken only by sporadic artillery and the occasional exchange of small arms fire as patrols encountered each other in the ruins. Müller managed a few hours of sleep, the shallow, alert rest of a combat soldier who could wake fully in seconds if needed. Dawn brought renewed American pressure. Their artillery began a systematic bombardment of the German positions in St. Lo, walking shells through the ruined streets with methodical precision. After the artillery came the tanks and infantry, probing the German defences, looking for weak points. From his position in the church tower, one of the few high points still standing in the devastated town, Müller could see American infantry working their way through the ruins to the east. They moved carefully, covering each other, using the debris for concealment. These were not the green troops who had landed on D-Day. These were veterans who had learned the hard lessons of urban combat. "Hold fire until they're within 200 meters, Müller instructed his men. "Make every shot count." Ammunition was critically short, another constant feature of the German experience in Normandy. While the Americans could fire almost at will, supported by seemingly endless supplies, the Germans had to conserve every bullet, every shell. It created a fundamental imbalance in combat power that no amount of tactical skill could fully overcome. The American advance reached a crossroads about 250 meters from the church. They paused there, setting up machine guns to cover further movement. A Sherman tank rumbled into position behind a partially collapsed building, its main gun scanning for targets. Müller watched through his binoculars, evaluating the threat. The tank was the primary concern. Its 75-meter gun could easily penetrate the church walls if it identified their position. They had a single Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon, but it would have to be used at much closer range to be effective. Schmidt, "Take 2 men to the building across the street," Müller ordered. "If that tank advances, hit it from the side with the Panzerfaust." Schmidt nodded and selected 2 soldiers, including the former policeman Kramer. They slipped out the back of the church and worked their way through the rubble to a position that would give them a flank shot if the Sherman moved closer. For hours, the situation remained in a tense stalemate. The Americans didn't advance further, apparently waiting for additional forces before pushing deeper into the German-held sections of town. Müller's men remained hidden, conserving strength and ammunition. As afternoon approached, the pattern of American artillery changed. Instead of the systematic bombardment of the morning, shells began to fall more randomly across the town. Then Müller noticed something else: German vehicles moving on the western outskirts of Saint-Lô. A runner arrived a short time later with new orders. General withdrawal from Saint-Lô. Fall back to positions 5 kilometers south of the city. Move in small groups after dark. It was the familiar pattern again. Resist, delay, withdraw. The defence of Saint-Lô, like so many other battles in Normandy, would end with a German retreat. Müller signalled to Schmidt across the street, indicating they would pull out after dark. Then he gathered the men in the church to explain the plan. "We'll move in 2 groups," he said. "Schmidt will lead the first group through the western sector. I'll take the second group along the river route. Rally point is the crossroads at La Chapelle-en-Jugé." The men accepted the news with the resignation of troops who had grown accustomed to retreat. There was no surprise, no protest, just the weary acknowledgement that they would abandon another position, sacrifice another piece of France in the slow-motion collapse of the Atlantic Wall. As darkness fell, the first group slipped away, moving through the ruins toward the German lines. Müller waited with the second group, maintaining a presence in the church to avoid alerting the Americans to their withdrawal. An hour later, they followed, leaving behind booby traps to slow any pursuit. The night was clear, with a half moon providing enough light to navigate through the devastated streets. They moved silently, alert for American patrols that might have infiltrated behind their lines. The retreat from Saint-Lô marked another milestone in the Battle of Normandy. The city had been a key road junction, a linchpin in the German defensive line. Its loss opened the way for American forces to push south toward Brittany and east toward the Seine. For Müller and his dwindling band of survivors, it was simply another step in their long withdrawal. They had been retreating since D-Day, trading space for time, trying to inflict enough casualties to make the Allies reconsider the cost of their advance, but the Allies had accepted the cost, had paid the price in blood, and kept coming. As they marched through the darkness, Müller reflected on the campaign. The vaunted Atlantic Wall had failed to repel the invasion. The hedgerow country, which should have been perfect defensive terrain, had been overcome by American ingenuity and overwhelming firepower. The cities and towns of Normandy turned into fortresses had been reduced to rubble and captured one by one. What hope remained for Germany? The war was being lost on all fronts. The Russians were advancing in the east. The Americans and British were breaking out of Normandy in the west. Italy had already fallen. The skies over Germany were filled with Allied bombers day and night. Yet they fought on, some from fanatical belief in the Nazi cause, some from a soldier's duty to obey orders, many simply to survive, to protect their comrades, to make it through one more day in a war they no longer believed could be won. Müller fell into the last category. He had seen too much, lost too many friends, retreated from too many positions to believe in final victory. He fought now for his men, to keep as many of them alive as possible in a campaign that seemed designed to grind the Wehrmacht to dust against the anvil of Normandy. They reached the rally point near dawn, joining Schmidt's group and other German units retreating from St. Lo. Staff officers directed them to their new positions along a hastily prepared defensive line. The cycle would begin again. Dig in, resist, delay, withdraw. As Müller supervised his men in preparing their new foxholes, he gazed back toward the north, where St. Lo now lay in American hands. How much longer could this continue? How many more defensive lines could be established and abandoned? Where was the strategic reserve that propaganda broadcasts constantly mentioned, but that never seemed to appear at the front? The answers would come soon enough. Unknown to Müller and his exhausted infantrymen, the Allied forces were preparing a major operation, a massive breakout attempt called Operation Cobra that would use carpet bombing to shatter German defences. When it came, it would mark the beginning of the end for German forces in Normandy. But for now, there was only the immediate reality, the foxhole that needed to be dug deeper, the machine gun that needed to be cleaned, the meagre rations that had to be distributed, the grinding, exhausting business of fighting a defensive campaign against an enemy with superior numbers, equipment, and air power. This was the German experience in Normandy, a long defeat, a fighting withdrawal, a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. For men like Karl Müller, who had survived thus far, the only victory left was survival itself. On the morning of July 25, 1944, the sky over Normandy filled with aircraft, not the fighter bombers that had been a constant presence since D-Day, but something far more imposing, waves of heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, their aluminum skins catching the sunlight as they approached in tight formation. Nearly 1,500 of them, escorted by 500 fighters, headed for a narrow stretch of the front line west of St. Lo. Lieutenant David Wilson, a 24-year-old tank commander with the 2nd Armoured Division, watched from his position just behind the American lines as the aerial armada passed overhead. After 7 weeks of grinding combat in the hedgerows, something big was finally happening. Operation Cobra, the breakout attempt that everyone had been whispering about for days. "Never seen anything like it," said Sergeant Pete Martinez, Wilson's gunner, as he stared up at the bomber stream. "Think this'll work, Lieutenant?" Wilson shrugged. "If this doesn't break them, nothing will." Their Sherman tank, nicknamed Betty Lou after Martinez's fiancée back in Texas, was one of hundreds positioned to exploit the gap the bombers were supposed to create. The plan was simple but audacious. Use heavy bombers, normally reserved for strategic targets, deep behind enemy lines, to carpet bomb a section of the German front. Once the defenders were stunned or destroyed, American armor and infantry would pour through the gap and into open country beyond the hedgerows. The bombing began at 9:38 a.m. From Wilson's position, it looked like the horizon itself was erupting. Waves of explosions walked across the German lines, throwing earth, trees, and bodies into the air. The ground shook as if from an earthquake. The sound was a continuous, rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. For nearly an hour, the bombers pounded a rectangular area about 3 miles wide and 1 mile deep. More than 4,000 tons of explosives fell in that small zone. When the last bomber had dropped its payload and turned back toward England, a pall of smoke and dust hung over the target area, visible for miles. "Mount up," came the order over the radio. "All units prepare to advance." Wilson and his crew climbed into Betty Lou. Wilson in the commander's cupola, Martinez in the gunner's seat, Corporal Jenkins driving, and Privates Doyle and Washington loading and operating the radio. They were a veteran crew now, having fought together since D-Day. Their original Sherman had been knocked out during the hedgerow fighting, but they had all survived to be assigned this replacement. The The tank's engine roared to life, adding to the growing rumble as hundreds of vehicles prepared to move forward. Artillery opened up, targeting areas beyond the bombing zone where German reserves might be organizing a counterattack. All elements of Combat Command A advance. Betty Lou lurched forward, joining a column of tanks moving toward what had been the German front line. The landscape they entered was apocalyptic, a moonscape of overlapping craters where nothing remained standing. The hedgerows that had defined the battlefield for weeks had been obliterated. Trees were reduced to splintered stumps. The rich Norman soil was turned inside out, exposing pale clay that looked like bleached bone in the summer sun. And there were bodies, or parts of bodies, everywhere. German soldiers caught in the open had simply ceased to exist as cohesive humans. What remained was scattered across the churned earth like grisly confetti. "Jesus," Martinez whispered over the intercom, "there's nothing left." He was wrong. As the American advance reached the far edge of the bombed zone, resistance appeared. Not the coordinated defense they had faced in the hedgerows, but desperate groups of survivors trying to hold together some semblance of a front line. Machine guns fired from shell craters. A Panzer IV tank, somehow intact despite the bombing, engaged 3 Shermans before being knocked out. Snipers took shots from the ruins of a small hamlet. But there was no stopping the American breakthrough now. The German line had been shattered, both physically and psychologically. Many survivors were in shock, unable to organize effective resistance. Others surrendered in groups, emerging from bunkers and cellars with vacant expressions and trembling hands. By nightfall, Wilson's unit had advanced nearly 7 miles, more than they had gained in the previous month of hedgerow fighting, and they weren't alone. All along the breakthrough sector, American armoured columns were pushing into open country beyond the bocage. Operation Cobra was succeeding beyond the most optimistic projections. The next day brought even more dramatic progress. With German defences in disarray, American armour and mechanised infantry raced south and east. Wilson's tank battalion covered nearly 20 miles, encountering only scattered resistance. The grinding attrition of the hedgerow battle had been replaced by a war of movement, the kind of mobile warfare that American forces had trained for but had been unable to execute in the confined Norman landscape. For the tankers, it was exhilarating after weeks of crawling forward a few hundred yards at a time. Betty Lou and the other Shermans roared down country roads and across open fields, their crews scanning for threats but finding few. Occasionally, a German anti-tank gun would fire from concealment, or a Panzerfaust team would attempt an ambush, but these were isolated incidents rather than the coordinated defense they had faced before. "This is more like it," Martinez said as they paused to refuel late on the second day. "If we'd been doing this since D-Day, we'd be in Paris by now." Wilson nodded, though he knew it wasn't that simple. The breakout had been possible only because of the weeks of grinding combat that had worn down German reserves and pulled their best units into the hedgerow battle. Operation Cobra had succeeded because the enemy no longer had the strength to resist across the entire front. On the third day, they reached Avranches, a small city at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. Its capture marked a strategic turning point. From Avranches, American forces could turn west into Brittany or east toward the Seine River and Paris. With the German line broken, both options were now available. General Patton's newly activated Third Army took over the exploitation of the breakthrough. His forces turned east, threatening to encircle all German forces still fighting in Normandy. Meanwhile, the British and Canadians launched their own offensive east of Caen, putting additional pressure on the already strained German defences. For Wilson and his tank crew, the dramatic change in the nature of the war was both welcome and disorienting. After weeks where progress was measured in yards and every hedgerow might hide an anti-tank gun, they were now advancing dozens of miles each day, often without firing a shot. The war had suddenly accelerated, creating a sense that the end might be in sight. But if the Americans were experiencing a heady rush of success, the German forces in Normandy were descending into a nightmare, with American armour driving east from Avranches and British forces pushing south from Caen. They faced the prospect of encirclement. Hitler, refusing to authorise a general withdrawal, ordered a counterattack at Mortain aimed at cutting off Patton's advancing spearheads. The attack, launched on August 7th, failed disastrously. With complete air superiority, Allied aircraft caught the German armoured columns in the open and devastated them. The last reserves had been committed and defeated. Now the trap began to close. By mid-August, American forces had reached Argentan from the south, while British and Canadian units approached Falaise from the north. Between them were elements of two German armies, nearly 100,000 men at risk of being completely surrounded. The area that would become known as the Falaise Pocket was roughly triangular, bounded by Argentan, Falaise, and the town of Chambois. As Allied forces tightened the noose, the German units inside faced a desperate choice: surrender or attempt to escape through the narrowing gap in the Allied lines. Most chose to try for escape, creating one of the most chaotic and devastating battle scenes of the war. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, along with their vehicles, artillery, and the remains of their panzer units, converged on the last possible exit routes. Allied aircraft circled overhead like vultures, striking at anything that moved. Artillery pounded the pocket day and night. And on the ground, American, British, Canadian, and Polish forces fought to close the final gap near Chambois. Inside the pocket, the situation deteriorated hourly. Food and medical supplies ran out. Ammunition became scarce. Vehicles, desperate for fuel, were abandoned by the hundreds. The wounded lay in makeshift aid stations with little or no treatment available. The dead went unburied, their bodies adding to the growing stench that hung over the battlefield. On August 19th, Wilson's tank battalion was part of the force assigned to close the last gap in the Allied lines near Chambois. As they approached the town, they encountered the full horror of what was happening inside the pocket. The roads leading east were choked with destroyed and abandoned German vehicles. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, staff cars, all jumbled together in a grotesque traffic jam. Between and beneath the vehicles lay bodies, hundreds of them, some intact, others torn apart by artillery or air attacks. Wounded men cried out for help that wouldn't come. Loose horses, their handlers dead, wandered aimlessly among the carnage. "My God," Jenkins whispered as they surveyed the scene from a ridge overlooking one of the escape routes. "It's like the end of the world down there." Wilson had never seen anything like it, not even on Omaha Beach. This wasn't combat as he had experienced it before. Two sides, fighting for tactical advantage. This was slaughter. Pure and simple. The Germans trapped in the pocket had nowhere to go, no way to fight back effectively. They were simply being annihilated. The final gap was closed on August 21st, though thousands of German soldiers had managed to escape before the pocket was completely sealed. Those who remained, estimated at between 50,000 and 60,000, were killed or captured. Allied soldiers who entered the pocket after its reduction would never forget what they found there. One American officer described it as a battlefield that surpassed even Hollywood's wildest imagination. Bodies were piled so thickly in some areas that vehicles could not pass without driving over them. The wreckage of over 10,000 vehicles littered the landscape. The stench was so overwhelming that hardened combat veterans became physically ill. For Wilson and his crew, the closing of the Falaise Pocket marked the effective end of the Battle of Normandy. Though pockets of German resistance remained in some coastal fortresses, the organised defence had collapsed. The road to Paris lay open, with Patton's forces already approaching the outskirts of the French capital. "Think we'll get to Paris?" Martinez asked as they performed maintenance on Betty Lou the day after the pocket was closed. "Doubt it," Wilson replied. "Word is we're heading for Belgium and the German border. Let the Free French have the glory of liberating Paris." He was right. The strategic objective now was not the French capital, but Germany itself. Allied forces were already planning the next phase of the campaign, the drive to the Rhine and into the German heartland. But first, there was a brief period of rest and reflection. Wilson's battalion pulled back to an assembly area near Argentat, where replacements, supplies, and fresh equipment arrived daily. The physical toll of nearly 3 months of continuous combat was evident in the men's gaunt faces and exhausted eyes. The mental toll was harder to see, but no less real. Wilson found himself unable to sleep for more than an hour or two at a time, jolting awake at the slightest sound. Martinez had developed a persistent twitch in his right eye. Jenkins, normally talkative, had grown silent and withdrawn. They were experiencing what the doctors called combat fatigue, but what the men themselves recognized simply as the accumulated strain of too many days under fire, too many friends lost, too much death witnessed and dealt. On a warm evening in late August, Wilson sat on the turret of Betty Lou, writing a letter to his parents in Pennsylvania. How could he describe what he had experienced since landing in Normandy? What words could possibly convey the terror of Omaha Beach, the claustrophobic dread of the hedgerows, the mechanical slaughter of the Falaise Pocket? In the end, he wrote about the French countryside, the historic towns they had passed through, the occasional kindness of civilians who offered food or wine to their liberators. He wrote about his crew, their health and spirits. He wrote about the weather, the food, trivial things that would reassure without revealing. The true Normandy, the one of mud and blood and death, he kept to himself. Perhaps someday he could speak of it, but not yet, not in a letter home. Around him, the vast Allied war machine was preparing for the next phase of the campaign. Fresh divisions arrived daily from England, trucks shuttled constantly between the beaches and the front, bringing forward the mountains of supplies needed to sustain the advance into Germany. Engineers rebuilt bridges, cleared roads, and constructed airfields in fields that had been battlegrounds just days before. The statistical summary of the Battle of Normandy was staggering. In just over 2 months of fighting, the Allies had suffered more than 209,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. The Germans had lost even more, around 200,000 casualties, plus another 200,000 taken prisoner. Nearly 20,000 French civilians had died, many in the Allied bombing that had preceded the invasion or destroyed towns during the campaign. But statistics couldn't capture the human reality of what had happened in Normandy. Each number represented a life ended or forever altered, a family that would receive a telegram bringing news of death or wounding, a young man who would return home changed in ways that those who hadn't experienced combat could never fully understand. For Wilson, the Battle of Normandy had been a transformative experience, from the horror of Omaha Beach to the triumphant breakout of Operation Cobra and the apocalyptic scenes of the Falaise Pocket. He had entered France as a newly commissioned lieutenant with textbook knowledge of armoured warfare. He emerged as a combat veteran who had seen the best and worst that humans could be, who had learned lessons about leadership and survival that no training could provide. As the sun set over the Norman countryside, Wilson finished his letter and sealed it in an envelope. Tomorrow would bring new orders, a new phase of the campaign, new challenges and dangers. Germany was still far from defeated, and hard fighting lay ahead on the road to Berlin. But tonight, in this peaceful corner of Normandy, Wilson allowed himself to believe that the worst was behind them. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, the hedgerow country conquered, the German armies in France shattered. The great gamble of D-Day had paid off, though at a terrible cost. In the soft evening light, the battlefield had begun to return to its former self. Farmers ventured into fields where the fighting had passed, assessing damage and beginning the long process of rebuilding. Children played in village squares that had been combat zones just weeks before. The resilience of the Norman people, like the land itself, was already asserting itself against the ravages of war. Wilson slipped down from the tank turret and walked to the nearby field where the battalion's mail was being collected. As he handed over his letter, he glanced back at Betty Lou, scarred by combat but still functional, still carrying him and his crew forward toward whatever waited ahead. Like the tank, he had been damaged but not broken by Normandy. He would carry its lessons and memories with him for the rest of his life. The Battle of Normandy had changed the course of the war, opening the Western Front that would eventually lead to Germany's defeat. It had also changed the men who fought in it, marking them in visible and invisible ways. Some of those marks would fade with time. Others would remain forever, like the thousands of white crosses that now dotted the Norman coastline where American cemeteries had been established. As night fell, Wilson returned to his crew, to the familiar routine of maintenance checks and preparation for whatever the next day might bring. The great drama of Normandy was ending, passing into history, even as those who had lived through it struggled to comprehend its full meaning. Elsewhere in Normandy, Tommy Miller, the young infantryman who had survived Omaha Beach and the hedgerow hell, was also reflecting on the campaign as his unit prepared to move toward the German border. In a half-destroyed barn that served as temporary shelter, he wrote in the journal he had carried since D-Day. "It's over, at least this part. We're leaving Normandy tomorrow. Hard to believe we've been in France less than 3 months. Feels like years, so many gone. Jackson, Martinez, Leibowitz, the lieutenant, Sarge from Baker Company, the replacement whose name I never learned. Too many to list. They say we're heading east, all the way to Germany. I just want to get it over with and go home. But first we finish what we started on Omaha." For James Cooper, the paratrooper who had dropped into darkness on the night before D-Day, Normandy had been a crucible that tested everything he thought he knew about himself and his fellow soldiers. Now, as his unit regrouped and integrated replacements for their heavy losses, he found himself acting as mentor to fresh-faced kids who hadn't experienced the desperate early days of the invasion. "Keep your head down, your weapon clean, and listen to the veterans," he advised a group of replacements who had arrived that morning. "Normandy was bad, but at least we knew the Germans couldn't get behind us because of the Channel. From here on, we'll be surrounded by enemy territory. Stay alert." And for Karl Müller, the German sergeant who had fought a losing battle from D-Day through the collapse of the Falaise pocket, Normandy had been the beginning of the end. He had escaped the pocket with a small group of his men, making their way east under cover of darkness, avoiding Allied patrols. Now they were part of the hasty defensive line being established along the Seine River, another temporary barrier that would inevitably be overcome. "We cannot win this war," he told Schmidt as they dug foxholes overlooking a crossing point on the Seine. "After what I saw in the pocket, there is no hope of victory now." Schmidt merely nodded. Words were unnecessary between men who had survived the crucible of Normandy. They would continue to fight, not for Hitler or Germany's conquests, but for each other and the slim hope of personal survival in a war that was clearly lost. Across Normandy, as August gave way to September, the physical evidence of battle began to fade. Farmers returned to their fields, working around bomb craters and disabled vehicles. Villages started to rebuild, clearing rubble and repairing damaged buildings. The dead, American, British, Canadian, German, French, were buried in hastily established cemeteries that would later become permanent memorials. But the impact of those 85 days of combat would echo through history. The Battle of Normandy had been the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, the successful establishment of the long-awaited Second Front that would eventually meet the Soviet advance from the east. More immediately, it had liberated much of France and positioned Allied forces to drive into the German homeland. For the men who fought there, Normandy would remain a defining experience, a time when ordinary humans were called upon to endure and accomplish extraordinary things. Farm boys from Kansas, factory workers from Michigan, clerks from New York, and their counterparts from Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations had faced the best that Germany could muster and prevailed, though at a terrible cost. They had come ashore on beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. They had fought through the deadly maze of the Bocage. They had liberated ancient Norman towns and villages. They had closed the Falaise pocket and shattered German military power in France. And now they would carry the war eastward, following the path they had opened on D-Day to its ultimate conclusion in the heart of the Third Reich. The sun set one final time on the Normandy battlefield, casting long shadows across ground that had been contested foot by bloody foot throughout the summer of 1944. In field hospitals, the wounded dreamed of home. In temporary camps, the exhausted slept the deep sleep of physical and emotional depletion. In newly dug graves, the dead kept their eternal silence. The Battle of Normandy was over. The war moved on, eastward toward Germany, leaving behind a transformed landscape and countless lives forever changed by what had happened on this small piece of French coastline and countryside. Years later, visitors would come to walk the beaches and hedgerows where so many had fought and died. They would stand in the American cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach with its endless rows of white crosses and stars of David. They would visit the museums and memorials that attempted to convey something of what had happened there, but only those who had lived through those 85 days in the summer of 1944 could truly know what it had been like to fight in the Battle of Normandy. As you rest now, perhaps you can imagine the quiet that finally settled over those Norman fields when the guns fell silent and the tanks rolled eastward, the gentle rustle of wind through apple orchards that had been battlegrounds, the slow return of birds to hedgerows that had concealed machine guns, the gradual healing of a land that had seen too much death but would, in time, become green and peaceful once more. And with that, close your eyes and drift off to sleep.